The AWARE project's aim is to balance the public conversation about psychedelics, spread accurate information, and give a new face to psychedelia. We feel that this change will occur through connection and relationship, one individual at a time. We are calling on everyone whose lives have been improved through the mindful use of psychedelics to educate themselves and become ambassadors for the psychedelic experience. Show those around you that people who use psychedelics mindfully across all social, racial, economic, and political boundaries.
Preparation and integration in addiction recovery with Ibogaine.
Oh, no.
So just a little bit about my path and how I found Ibogaine. As was mentioned in the bio, I was struggling with a 10-year opiate addiction, and I pretty much had the typical sequence of events laid out for me as far as opiate addiction goes. I was introduced to painkillers at a young age, and then just, ended up progressing to heroin, which was just a cheaper, more powerful substitute. So through that, I've been through multiple conventional rehabs. About 5 different rehabs and detoxes, all the conventional ways. Tried 12 steps a few different times, and I really put my heart and soul into the 12 steps a couple times that I tried it, and it really didn't work for me, no matter how much I worked it. So with that being said, however, the last time that I did do rehab and actually got clean through my opiate addiction, I was so over it. I was bartending. I was basically a shell of a human being, just kind of drifting through life, and I knew something needed to change. So I put myself into a conventional rehab outside of Philadelphia for 30 days, and then on a whim, right after rehab, I flew out to San Diego and relocated. And the first year here was awesome. I was, really doing stuff I'd never done before. I was getting into yoga and meditation. I was surfing a lot, and really building a relationship with myself like I've never really built before. I was really starting to get to know myself well. And about a year into me living out here, I ended up getting a hernia, and I had to get surgery. And instead of doing Percocet and Narco, which was prescribed to me, I didn't want to do pharmaceutical opiates, so I was looking for something different. So that's when I found kratom. And kratom is a plant that's indigenous to Indonesia, and it has opioid agonist properties very similar to opiates and prescription painkillers. And not quite as addictive as regular opiates, but still addictive nonetheless. And I was not aware of how addictive kratom was. So after about a month or so of taking kratom, and it was time to get off, I started noticing nausea and just uncomfortability in the stomach. I was sweating, and these symptoms were just horribly familiar. And I ended up catching a physical addiction to kratom. And just at that point in my life, I was working full time. I was going to school, and I just really didn't have time to go through the motions of physical withdrawal. And I was always interested in psychedelic plant medicines, just the way that these medicines are able to go into the psyche and just really kind of reconstruct your thought patterns and tap into that subconscious essence. And Ibogaine in particular really spoke with me, just because of Ibogaine is a little bit different than other plant medicines because it has a physiological component to it that is able to go in there and alleviate all of or most of physical withdrawals, which is why Ibogaine really speaks on a deep level to opiate addicts. So I was talking to some friends out in San Diego and was referred to a really awesome center down in Mexico, and I ended up going to a bank. I got a loan, and I was off to Mexico to do Ibogaine. And as far as my Ibogaine experience went, I had a really vivid, intense experience, and basically I ended up. I had visions in my experience, and one of the visions in particular really tapped into me. And basically, what happened was the vision was I saw myself in the third person at about 5 years old, and I was on the playground playing with this little girl, and we got into this fight, and she ended up pushing me over, and she ran away, and I was crying a whole lot, and just through this vision, it was really prevalent to me that a lot of my self-consciousness around people and relationships, and especially women, was rooted in this one particular event that happened to me about 5 years old. And I didn't even remember this event happening until I actually saw the vision and slowly started remembering little bits of it. And the way that Ibogaine really hit this home for me, that it's a long process. Ibogaine, it's about 8 to 12 hours is the peak of an Ibogaine experience, and through that time, I was just being shown this vision over and over and over again for what seemed like hours and hours and hours. Basically, Ibogaine smacking me in the face with a 2x4, which was this traumatic event, and it was very, very prevalent to me that this is where there was something here, and this is where a lot of my self-consciousness was rooted. And then through my integration process, after seeing this vision, I started doing a lot of work on myself, and I started noticing that my self-consciousness was also, it was rooted in this, but throughout my adolescence and childhood, I was a really big athlete, and in high school, I was a big-time wrestler. I was in the newspaper, and people knew who I was, and people looked up to me, and I kind of, I hid behind that, and I felt like I wasn't going to be able to live up to to that Tyler that I thought everybody perceived me as. So I kind of kept everybody at arm's distance throughout my entire life, and I actually thought that I had deep relationships with people until I started looking back on it and doing the work. And I was really afraid that if people, if I let people in and they peek behind that veil of my athletic ability, my athletic identity, I just would not have enough to offer them. I wasn't deep enough, and I just wasn't enough. And through that, I realized that a lot of my addiction was really rooted around around the idea that I just thought I wasn't enough. And I started taking opiates and heroin really to just make me feel comfortable with myself and feel comfortable in social situations. And since then, I have really done a lot of work on myself and built up a lot of confidence, and was really able to cultivate a more nurturing relationship with myself and then other people in my life. And Ibogaine truly changed my life in that way. Now, a little bit about what I do. Why am I up here talking about Ibogaine, and what kind of, what experience do I have to really give me the right to do that? And as I said, my 10 years of addiction, looking back on it, I really didn't want that to be a waste of time. I didn't want that to be a negative in my life. I wanted it to be a positive. So I wanted to use that time and use it to help other people and empathize and connect with other people and help them go through the same issues that I was going through. And I did know that I did not want to do it through the conventional modalities, as the rehabs that are set up in the US and 12 steps, just because it didn't work for me. So, when I found Ibogaine, it was, it was like the fire was lit inside of me. I truly found my calling and my passion. So I really wanted to get involved with Ibogaine as much as I could as soon as possible. So the first thing that I did is I called up a bunch of centers in Mexico. Living in San Diego was nice. I could go right across the border, and I was able to bring my gong and my flute and my drums and start facilitating sound healing for some of the patients down there before and after Ibogaine. And that was my first step in the door. And then actually it was about 2 years ago at an Aware Project event, I ended up meeting somebody, and we ended up talking and connected, and through that, through that relationship, I was offered a job working sales and intake at Crossroads Ibogaine Center in Mexico. And what I did for them was when people called in about inquiring about the medicine, I would tell them about the medicine. I would tell them about the center, how everything worked, and I would also, I was the first point of contact. I also worked with the families, and there's a lot of fear surrounding Ibogaine, especially the idea that the person addicted or the family members are sending somebody down to a third world country to do a psychedelic that's illegal in the States to overcome a terrible chronic health issue like addiction. And I actually want to back up because I don't think addiction is chronic, and I just wanted to correct myself real quick there. But there is a lot of fear surrounding it. What I did was I worked on alleviating as much of that fear as possible. And I also helped people find aftercare options afterwards as well, and referred them to different aftercare centers or different modalities of aftercare. And since then, I graduated from San Diego State University with a bachelor's degree in psychology, and I am going to be pursuing grad school, I'm pretty sure, in the near future. And I've also become a transformational recovery coach, and I went through a certification program to become that with the recovery and coaching company Being True to You. And basically what I do is, Being True to You is an amazing company. I mean, it's really revolutionary in the realms of addiction and how addiction is looked at and how addiction recovery is looked at. And Being True to You, it pulls from a lot of different modalities out there and really puts forth a really amazing program that is really like that's like anything else I've ever seen before in my 10 years of trying to overcome addiction. And the way that it was just laid out was just it really spoke to me. And what I do as a recovery coach is, I work one-on-one with people. I specialize in Ibogaine preparation and integration of Ibogaine treatment as it relates to addiction. I also work with other psycho-spiritual treatments as well. I help people prepare for ayahuasca ceremonies or meditation retreats and breathwork retreats, but my true specialty is in Ibogaine. I work one-on-one with people over the phone or via Skype. I work with the family as well, helping them prepare, and helping them integrate, and helping them with aftercare options as well. So I'm up here talking about Ibogaine. You've heard Ibogaine, and let's talk about what Ibogaine actually is. And Ibogaine, it's a psychedelic medicine, and Ibogaine is derived from the Tabernacle iboga shrub, which is native to Western Africa. And this psychedelic plant is very unique in its ability to heal addiction. The iboga shrub is used by the Bwiti people of Gabon, Africa, shamanically in their Bwiti religion as a sacrament for rites of passage ceremonies, particularly to evoke death and rebirth experiences. Ibogaine, in and of itself, it's one of 12 alkaloids, 12 or so alkaloids that the iboga shrub is composed of. And Ibogaine is separated from the iboga shrub using hydrochloride, which is a saline or salt solution. So if you go to look up treatment centers, and you're going to see a lot of Ibogaine HCl, and that's what that HCl means. And the reason that Ibogaine is used over iboga is Ibogaine it's a little bit more gentler on a person, on the psyche and on the body as well, in the full complexity of the plant. And for people coming in that are so battered down by addiction physically and emotionally, it's just an easier pathway to utilize the plant for addiction. And
Sorry.
no worries. And one other thing about Ibogaine, so I've heard some people talk about iboga, and Ibogaine is is referred to as a medicine of the mind. And yeah, and basically what Ibogaine does is being a medicine of the mind. It helps loosen the control that the mind has over us, and it helps us think back more into our heart. The mind is definitely a powerful tool that helps us accomplish things in our day-to-day life. However, we shouldn't be driven by the mind, ultimately, but by the heart, and that intuitive guidance that the heart gives us. So Ibogaine is a detox from our mental patterns as well. All right, so there are 3 parts, I say, to Ibogaine treatment. It's preparation, the experience, and then integration. And preparation is very, very important. No matter how powerful the effects and benefits of Ibogaine can be, bottom line is that the person still has to be ready to do the work, or ultimately the treatment's not going to work for the most part. You know, I truly think that recovery doesn't necessarily start at the moment of abstinence, but recovery starts way before abstinence. When a person realizes that, you know, their addiction is no longer serving them and is a poison to their life, and realize that they need help, that's when recovery starts. When people start inquiring about help, whatever modality it may be, Ibogaine, rehab, that's when recovery truly starts. And recovery and preparation is a mindset. And you know, one of the first things I think that's probably the most important thing about preparation is finding somebody to talk to. That's what I do as a coach, or you know, any type of therapy someone can have where they can talk to somebody and get a lot of that internal dialogue out of the mind and into the material realm can be really, really helpful. And you know, on top of that, I also like to, once I build a rapport and a bond with the person addicted, yeah, I like to start talking about the traumatic events that they might remember and the fears that they have. Just going over this and getting a good idea of what these are, I find that when the person actually goes into the Ibogaine experience, because this stuff is at the forefront of their psyche, it makes it a lot easier for the Ibogaine to go in there and pull this stuff up. The next thing that I really like to drive home with people is that expectations are your enemy. And look, I get it, you know, it's the human condition to think about what could happen and go down that rabbit hole of possibilities, but ultimately, you know, the less expectations somebody can have, the better. There's normally two forms of expectations people have. Either they're looking at Ibogaine as a silver bullet or a cure for addiction, which it definitely is not. You know, they have this expectation that they're going to come out of their Ibogaine experience completely alleviated of their addiction and their urges and their withdrawals, and most of the time that's not the case. And if that expectation is not met, it can be extremely defeating and daunting for a person, and making it that much harder for them to actually work through their integration process. Another expectation that I find is pretty prevalent with going into Ibogaine is just how scary Ibogaine can be. You go into social media, you go to media, you go into forums like Reddit, and you see these grand tales of Ibogaine. And, you know, most of the time the stories you're going to hear on these experiences are going to be to the extremes, either how Ibogaine worked so well for them and they had this extreme, amazing, intense experience, or how it didn't work at all. You're also going to hear people talk about how grueling it is and how, you know, how intense it was. And, you know, in this case, I think language is kind of important because, yeah, Ibogaine is going to be an intense medicine. It is, and, you know, looking at it as something grueling is, you know, it's not the best way to go about it, but it's powerful. It's a powerful medicine, and it has to be powerful, being the medicine of the mind as it is. You know, to go in there and kind of separate yourself from these mental patterns and thought processes, it's got to be a powerful experience. And, you know, I think I try to kind of reconstruct the way people look at it as more of a, you know, a powerful experience instead of a scary, grueling experience. And, you know, a couple things that I like to tell people as far as preparation goes going into it. You know, I like to tell people, you know, stop expecting what you think is going to happen and just notice what is actually happening. Another thing that I like to tell people also is just hope to get something out of it. And, you know, going into the experience like that is, you know, it's kind of mitigating and minimizing the expectations somebody does have. I also find that with these expectations people have, it makes it a little more difficult. Ibogaine's got to go in there and it's got to work through these false storylines that people tell themselves about the Ibogaine experience, and before it actually gets to the meat of a person's issues. So, you know, the less expectations somebody has, the less energy and time Ibogaine's putting into actually working through those false storylines and getting to the meat of the issues. There's a couple simple things too that you can do for preparation, and, you know, it's kind of tough. Most of the time when I talk to people, they're still using heavily in their addiction, and, you know, it's tough conveying preparation to somebody that's still in that addictive mindset. And just simple things like a 30-second gratitude prayer in the morning and staying consistent with that definitely has a cumulative effect. I also like to tell people, write down 5 or 10 questions that you want answered. Ibogaine has a way of answering questions pretty literally. And these questions that I ask people to write down is kind of like intention setting, but a little bit different. It's a little more direct and a little bit more personalized. So I help people reconstruct those questions to make it a little more simple and make it easier for the psyche and the Ibogaine to scan over that in the experience. And then I also tell the person to give these questions to the person that's watching them. Typically when you're in Ibogaine treatment, you have someone watching you. You have a watcher that's there for you. And for them to read these questions back to the person once or twice during the actual experience, it is an intense experience, and there's a lot going on, and it's likely you're probably going to forget some of these questions that you asked yourself. So I think it's good to have a little bit of that active role with the person watching them and actually reading these questions back. Now, let's get into how Ibogaine actually works and the mechanisms, some of the mechanisms behind Ibogaine. Ibogaine works in 2 different ways typically. It works physiologically on the brain, and it also works psychologically through the actual psychedelic experience. And one way that Ibogaine works on the brain is that it actually goes into the brain and it works on particular receptor sites in the brain, the serotonin, dopamine, opioid, and acetylcholine receptor sites, just to name a few. Basically, when a person's in their addiction and they put these substances in their body, and right after they put the drug in their body, their brain gets flooded with these neurotransmitters, and this is where those feelings of euphoria and happiness and connectedness come in. And then over an extended period of time, when a person doesn't have the drug in their system, their brain starts having to work overtime to replenish these depleted receptor sites. So one thing Ibogaine does, it goes in there almost immediately and it replenishes these receptor sites. And what that means is after about 2 hours or so, a person's withdrawal symptoms are completely taken away. And through the actual experience of Ibogaine, I'd say it's about an 8 to 12 hour experience where you're peaking. And then the whole experience overall is about 24 hours after you recover. And after about that 24-hour period, there are some residual withdrawal symptoms that do tend to come back. But I would say overall about 90 to 95% of a person's withdrawal symptoms are taken away. So about 5 or 10% of withdrawal symptoms that do come back, they're just a lot easier to work through and deal with. Another way that Ibogaine works physiologically on the brain is it acts as a sort of scrubber, and it goes in there and scrubs away existing neural pathways that are created, particularly the ones that are negatively reinforcing the addictive behavior. Also, in your addiction, when you're going through the motions of addiction, it is definitely behavioral. If someone is someone's feeling a lot of anxiety or fear, or something really bad happens in their day. To cope with all of that, they go to the drug. They go to the drug to help them, alleviate some of that pain. It's behavioral, and the more that they engage in these behaviors, the more that these neural pathways are formed and reinforce those negative behaviors. And Ibogaine goes in there again and acts sort of as a scrubber in essence, and it scrubs these neural pathways away. And between that and replenishing these receptor sites, in essence, almost, it kind of resets a person's brain. And then, just through this process also, it really speaks to the neuroplasticity of a person's brain, how it actually breaks down old neural pathways and allows new synapses and pathways to grow. One last way that Ibogaine works physiologically on the brain is when Ibogaine is put into the body, it actually gets metabolized into something called noribogaine. And what noribogaine does, it attaches itself to the receptor sites and actually stays with a person for about 3 to 4 months following Ibogaine treatment. And what that means is for about 3 to 4 months, a person, the cravings that a person experiences is going to be a lot less, a lot more minimized, and then the intensity of these cravings as well are going to be a lot less intense and a lot easier to deal with. So as far as the way Ibogaine works psychologically on the brain through the actual psychedelic experience. It conveys these messages in two different ways, typically through vision is one way, through the visions that people get, and then also through the actual psychedelic experience, through the vision somebody gets, and then also through the deep introspective thought that people get as well, going through the Ibogaine experience. And I would say about 35 to 40% of people actually get visions when dealing with addiction. A person is so broken down mentally, and because there is that mental detox that Ibogaine offers, it really has to work on all of that before a person starts really getting these really vivid visions. And if someone was to go into an Ibogaine or an Iboga experience for more spiritual reasons and more introspective reasons, they're typically going to get, have more of a chance to get these visions. But just because of the nature of addiction and how broken down a person is mentally, that about 35 to 40% of people get visions. And a couple examples of what these visions are is some of the examples I've heard people talk to me about. One is I've heard people talk about how they felt like they journeyed to the realm of the dead, and basically went to this realm of the dead and had a conversation with their ancestors, and realized that they had some ancestral trauma that was transferred into their present life. And just realizing that some of the hang-ups they have and some of the trauma that they have isn't even actually their own, but transferred from an old ancestor. And it's really interesting that I hear people tell me about that, because it relates back to what the Bhuitis use Iboga for, to evoke these death and rebirth experiences, which I think is pretty cool. A second example I hear when people share their visions is kind of like the one that I shared with you earlier, about how people can see themselves in the third person and they revisit these events, and they're able to perceive these events in a different way by seeing these events happen and play out in the third person. They're able to have more of an overhead or 360-degree view, and they're able to see all the different characters that were engaged in this event, and just get a different perspective of how it all played out. Sometimes it brings up events, like I said, that you don't even remember happening, and just even an acknowledgement that these events happened can be extremely powerful and healing as well. A third example that I've heard people talk about is they envision possible storylines that haven't happened yet to them, and how those storylines might negatively affect them. So basically, Ibogaine shows them, if you keep going down this path and thinking this way, this is what could happen, and it conveys that through vision some of the time. And just one more thing. Preparation and the way that somebody preps for Ibogaine can really enable these visions and this deep introspective thought I'm going to be talking about to be a lot more powerful in the experience as well. Now for the deep introspective thought that people get during their experience. And basically, your mind is working at its most optimal level. And what I mean by that is that your brain is working in a way, and your mind's working in a way that it's never worked before. You're able to, one way is you're able to step back and really analyze the relationships you have in your life and the attachments to these relationships. And relationships to family and friends, relationships to your boss or coworkers, relationships to money and fear. There's a lot of different relationships that we have, and we have positive and negative attachments to these relationships. And through the way that your mind's working at this optimal capacity, you're able to take a step back and understand these relationships and attachments in a very different way, and work through them and release the parts of them that aren't serving you, and reinforce the parts of them that are serving you. Something to touch on about my personal experience, and something that I've heard other people talk about as well, is unlike other psychedelics like ayahuasca, for example, where I definitely feel I'm more going like outwardly, I'm hitting different dimensions and talking to different entities. And with Ibogaine, you really have this feeling that you're going inward. And like with all psychedelics, you're really able to tap into the interconnectedness and the oneness of the universe. And with Ibogaine, you're really tapping into that by going inside of you, because that infinity, that is all inside of us as well. And by the way you go inward, it's like you're having a conversation with your best self, the best you that you could possibly be, void of addiction and fear and jealousy. It's the best you. And through this conversation, in essence, it's almost like you're your own therapist. And I know for me, it was a lot more powerful to hear these things coming from myself than going to a psychologist or a therapist and telling someone I didn't really know about my issues, and then telling me what's wrong with me and what I have to do. One last way, Ibogaine does work in other ways as well. These are just the ones that I'm touching on. Ibogaine really allows you to analyze the resistances that we have and the way that we perceive our realities in our life. So basically, especially with addiction, people have this lens where they're in this problem-based way of looking at things. And it's in the experience, there'll be problems and there'll be issues that come up, and throughout a person's life, it's they're just constantly thinking about the problem. They're dwelling on the problem. This problem-based way of looking at things, and it's almost like a mental loop that they get stuck in and can't work through. And what Ibogaine does, it does a really good job to really switch the way that you perceive these problems, and it puts you into more of a solution-based way of looking at things. And you start looking at these problems, and you start going, all right, well, what's the solution to these problems? How can I work through these problems? And then one step further, for some people, that they actually start looking at the teachers in these problems and how these problems can actually start making them a better person. And through that, they just get a deeper sense of gratitude for the resistances that come up in their life, and start looking at the teacher and all these resistances. And this all happens in the Ibogaine experience, which is really important, as I'm going to touch on integration, what we do afterwards to harness these insights and really apply them practically to our day-to-day. And what I think to be is the most important aspect of the entire Ibogaine treatment, I think it's even more important than actually going down and doing the Ibogaine, is the integration and what we do afterwards. And just because the way that it works, Ibogaine works physiologically on the brain and kind of wipes the brain and resets the brain in the way that it does, people have the ability to now build new behavioral and psychological foundations on top of the wiping of the brain. And ideally, aftercare, an inpatient holistic aftercare center is without a doubt the most ideal form of aftercare. There's a handful of aftercare centers around the world, and there's a few in the US that are specifically solely designed for people coming out of their Ibogaine experience for addiction. And they're very holistic. They really structure their programs around healing the body, the mind, and the spirit through yoga and things like Tai Chi, meditation, breath work, psychotherapy, and nutrition. And however, unfortunately, because of the legality of Ibogaine, it's still a Schedule I drug in the US, none of this stuff is paid for by insurance. So just doing Ibogaine and having to find an inpatient aftercare center can be really taxing on the pocket and really tough to pay out of pocket. So what I do is try to come up with some more creative ways to help somebody with aftercare. And when a person comes out of their Ibogaine experience, they're going to be in a very hypersensitive state. They're going to be hypersensitive to their own thoughts and internal dialogue. They're going to be hypersensitive to the interactions they have with other people, and as well as the subtle energies that are going on around them as well. So I think it's really important for someone to really separate themselves from society and isolate themselves from all of that distraction as long as possible. One thing that I really like to combine is wolfing and recovery coaching. And what wolfing stands for is the Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farming. basically there's these organic farms set up all around the country and all around the world where you're able to go on these farms and you're able to work on the farms, and for the work that you put in, they provide you with room and board. And it's a great way to tap back into nature and really tap back into yourself with minimal distractions. And because they let you, live there for free, basically, and for the work you put in, it's a lot more financially feasible. And combining that with the recovery coaching, I have found a lot of success in. A couple suggestions I like to make to people, as well as I coach them to integrate their Ibogaine experience. One is journaling, I think, is really great. What journaling does, it allows a different dynamic of interpreting the reality and the Ibogaine experience. And just getting that stream of consciousness, again, out of the mind and on paper. And keeping that stuff in the head can, there's energetic signatures, I feel like, and inertia behind these thoughts, and there's a big release getting them out. Another thing that I like to work with, there's different forms of ecstasis or flow states. And flow state is basically when you hear somebody, they're in the zone. That's when they're in flow. Athletes or a comedian up on stage or a freestyle rapper, for instance, or they get into these states of flow. And basically, what's going on in the brain in flow state is your prefrontal cortex is basically shut down, and that's where the prefrontal cortex is where your sense of self, past and present reside. And shutting that down really allows a person to be more present and in the moment. And there's been some pretty cool studies out there around how flow state can be used as a really great tool, as a springboard towards transformational experiences. So I like to challenge some of my clients to pick up new hobbies that might evoke flow, such as ecstatic dance, martial arts. Surfing was a great practice for me to evoke flow, and also improv exercises as well. Another great outlet is tapping into that creative side. I also tell people, if they can, to draw a picture or paint a picture that reminds them of their Ibogaine experience, or write a poem or a short story that reminds them of their Ibogaine experience. You're going to get a lot of these realizations and a lot of these downloads in the actual experience, but over the course of a week to months following the Ibogaine experience, they're going to dissolve. You're going to start forgetting a lot of these memories. So any way that a person can cultivate those memories that's going to streamline them back to the experience, I think, can be really powerful. Another favorite modality of mine is dream journaling. And for not everybody is tapped into dream journaling, and that doesn't speak to anybody, but for the people that it does, I found it to be really, really beneficial. And this is because Ibogaine, it conveys a lot. There's a lot of stuff coming up during your Ibogaine experience, and a lot of it can be caught by the conscious mind, but there are some messages that are conveyed more subtly, and your conscious mind misses it, but it's grasped by the subconscious mind. So in your dream states, in those environments, those realms, you're able to perceive some of these and get some of these downloads that are conveyed a little more subtly. And basically, I tell people to get a journal, put it by their bed every morning when they wake up for about 10 minutes, log your dream. And what happens over an extended period of time is that you start noticing consistencies in your dream, imagery or feelings that you have internally, and you start getting more familiar and build a relationship with this subconscious dream realm. So, for example, you might be driving down the street one day and you look over to your left and you see this red barn, and you're like, I know that red barn. That red barn comes up in my dream a lot. I'm dreaming right now, and your dream then becomes lucid. And what that means is you're awake in your dream, and you can start navigating that realm a little bit more, and really tapping into the subtle messages that are conveyed during the Ibogaine experience. A couple other things that I like to suggest, just a lot more simple for integration. And some of the stuff that I've mentioned can be a little difficult. People that are coming out of their Ibogaine experience, or some of them are still pretty battered down by their years and years of addiction and the Ibogaine experience as well. And so many things like journaling and improv exercises and stuff like that can be still pretty difficult. So even simple exercises. So something that really helped me is, I built an altar after my Ibogaine experience. Just a little altar. I put, some stuff on there that reminded me of the experience and some other stuff that, meant something to me. And this altar was created just to keep myself in gratitude and mindful and present. I took that altar and I put it in a place in my house where I would have to walk by it every day before I left the house. And, even just for a second, I would check out that altar and I was like, be grateful, be present. And it was a great way to send myself on my way for that day. And, maybe in and of itself, just in that moment, it's not going to do much for you, but I do believe that, cumulatively over time, seeing that altar, it builds and it creates these neural pathways, these positively reinforcing neural pathways, and over time, these little things can be really powerful. Another thing that I used to do is I took a marker and I wrote a big G on my forearm and on my hand. So, G stood for gratitude, and when I was going about my day-to-day and I got caught up in the hecticness of my day, I'd maybe look down and I'd notice that G. Even if just for a second, I would have this moment of clarity and just kind of like, all right, be grateful, be present. And it was just a little escape, even if for a second, in the hecticness of my day-to-day. And just little things like that, I found to be pretty powerful as they accumulate over time. I like to tell people, any forward momentum, as long as you're moving forward in your recovery and in your integration, that's a good thing. Now there's a really cool research study that I wanted to talk about real quick that was just published in September 2017. And basically this was the largest observational study to date that was conducted evaluating the efficacy of Ibogaine treatment for opioid use disorder, and it was published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Psychedelic Studies, again in September 2017. This retrospective study consisted of 88 former patients with chronic opioid use who had previously received Ibogaine treatment from Crossroads Ibogaine Center between 2012 and 2015. This collaborative study was conducted by members from Johns Hopkins Behavioral Pharmacology Unit, Crossroads Treatment Center, and the Yale School of Medicine. And some of the findings that they found in this research, out of the 88 participants, 80% of the patients experienced a drastic reduction or elimination of withdrawal symptoms. 41% reported sustained abstinence from opioids at the time of survey, being opioid-free for at least 6 months or more. Out of the 88 participants, 30% or 1/3 of the participants reported sustained abstinence for 1 year or more. And then again, out of that 30%, out of that 1/3 of patients that we're talking about sustained abstinence for 1 year or more, 31% of them reported sustained abstinence for 2 years or more. Although 48% of the full sample reported a lapse or relapse after treatment, they did report a decrease in consumption from pre-treatment levels. And I thought that was pretty cool because just through my path of going through conventional rehabs and working 12 steps, it's really conveyed that Ibogaine is a chronic disease, which is something that I do not agree with. They told me in 12 steps that my addiction is doing push-ups while I was sober, and if I was to relapse, that the addiction was going to come back full force and even harder than it was before. And this study shows that in 48% of the people, that addiction came back much less stronger, and they were using a lot less. One thing I do want to touch on, I am saying some negative stuff about 12 steps, and look, 12 steps help a lot of people, and I know I have a lot of friends that are in 12 steps, and it's one modality out there. And like I said, it didn't work for me, but it does help a lot of people. I think one of the most important things about 12 steps and any probably the most important thing about overcoming any addiction is connection and tapping back into a community. You know, we are innately social animals. You know, it's in our blood. It's in our DNA to seek out community. We're tribal, and as a person goes through their addiction, you know, they feel that void and that need to connect through a drug, through a substance, and you know that pulls them further away from human connection. And it's really important after someone, you know, gets sober and starts working through overcoming their addiction, that they find community, some outlet that they can tap into and connect with people that are, you know, where they feel appreciated and people that understand them. So I think one of the biggest parts about AA or 12 steps is that community as well. But one other thing is I think language is really important. I don't really use the term relapse. I like to use the term slip up. You know, I think there's a lot of stigma around the word relapse, and there's a lot of guilt, and there's a lot of shame that's associated with relapse. You have to start over your clean days, and you know, a person going through addiction is already feeling they're holding on to a lot of guilt and a lot of shame. So I like to call them slip-ups. It's all part of the process. The way it's all about perspective. You know, if you can look at your slip-up and figure out why you slipped up, what was going on beforehand, and how you felt afterwards, it can actually be used as a positive. And again, you know, Ibogaine helps with the way it kind of switches our perspective, our lens, into more of a solution-based way of thinking. Now I'd like to talk about the spiritual connection of Ibogaine. So you might have heard me say a couple things throughout the talk. You know, just the work that you put in. If you meet Ibogaine halfway, then it's going to meet you there as well. Or you know, Ibogaine has the ability to bring up these repressed emotions. Almost speaking about Ibogaine as if it has an essence to it or an intelligence. And you know, like with all psychedelic plants out there, I do think that there is a personality to each individual one, and they offer you something different. And you know, they talk about like a masculine or a feminine energy. You know, you hear people talk about ayahuasca as having a very feminine energy to it. You know, it's called the madre, or the mother. Ibogaine, however, definitely has a masculine energy to it. For sure, and you hear a lot of people talk about the masculine energy and the personality almost as like a stern father, and you know, giving you more tough love, kind of smacking me in the face with a 2x4 that was that traumatic event for myself. You know, that's the way that it was conveyed to me, and as well as the way that other psychedelics are used. You know, psychedelics have a way of connecting you to the oneness, the interconnectedness of the universe. And again, with Ibogaine, you're able to tap into that inward. You go inside of it, and you're able to tap into that oneness and that infinity. Also, you know, I also like to talk to people about, you know, all right, like, let's not talk about Ibogaine as an intelligence, but let's look at it more of a key that can unlock our insights and realizations to help us grow. And you know, I truly believe that we already have everything that we need to heal. Everything's already inside of us, and that everything is our true self. And you know, through life, as we go through the motions of life, and you know, there's media and friends and work and the various stressors out there and addiction. These things, as you know, we go through this process, we start to build barriers up around our true self, and we start getting to become disconnected with our true self and, you know, our purpose. And what Ibogaine does, as well as other psychedelics as well, it has the ability to dissolve those barriers and reconnect us back to our true self. And if you do put the work in, and if you give the medicine the respect, and build that relationship with the medicine, it's going to notice, and it's going to meet you halfway, and it's going to allow the medicine to work that much more effectively and powerful. And as you're able to reconnect back with your true self, as you start really feeling into what your passion is, and that connectivity, that universal oneness, that connection to community and friends, that passion. Reconnecting with that is a truly spiritual experience as well. So, over the past hour or so, I've talked about my personal experience with Ibogaine, preparation and integration, recovery coaching, the spiritual and scientific mechanisms behind Ibogaine as well. And I did save this one part for at the end as more of a disclaimer. And this is one thing that kind of bothers me within the industry. People will start talking about Ibogaine as a silver bullet or a cure for addiction. And Ibogaine is not a silver bullet or a cure. It's not a miracle cure. It is a highly personalized medicine, and it works differently with each person. Some people get breakthrough realizations and visions right off the spot, like I do. Some people don't get visions at all. The second time that I did Ibogaine, I didn't get any visions. Some people get their withdrawal symptoms completely taken away. A lot of people do not, and some people it takes some time for these realizations to really come through. I've heard some people say that Ibogaine doesn't even work to its fullest effective potential until about 3 to 4 weeks after taking Ibogaine. With that being said, bottom line, like with any other modality of healing, with any other modality used as far as psychedelic therapy, you have to put the work in. You have to show up, ready to do the work, ready to take control of your transformational journey. And in my experience, 100%, if you show up, ready to do the work, Ibogaine is without a doubt the most powerful tool out there to heal addiction. Thank you.
So we have time for about 10 minutes of questions.
I have two questions. One was Ibogaine made illegal and why, do you think? And the second one, whether you could comment on the difference before psychedelic or Ibogaine experience between setting intentions and having expectations. Because,
sure. Yeah, so I'll answer each of those. The first one was why was Ibogaine, or when was Ibogaine made illegal and why? I'm not exactly sure when it was. I want to say in the 60s sometime, but I could be wrong about that. And, I mean, there's a number of reasons why Ibogaine is perceived to be made illegal. First off, it's a psychedelic, and during that period of time, all psychedelics were made illegal. I tend to think that there's a little more scandalous reasons afoot here, and something like Ibogaine, first off, it's kind of like a one-time treatment where you don't have to be put on pharmaceuticals for the rest of your life. People tend to, after taking Ibogaine, get off of all their antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and just the money that's brought in to the pharmaceutical companies with just the painkillers, and it's like epidemic right now. I read something the other day that the CDC reported, this in the last like 6 months or so, that they estimate that 91 people die a day due to opioid overdose. So I think that it is there's a few different parts to that question, but like all psychedelics, I feel like it's there's something going on with the pharmaceutical companies, and just how there's a lot of money to be lost. And I think that's across the board with a lot of psychedelics. And then the second question you asked was?
The difference between setting intentions before an experience like this versus having expectations?
Yeah, so setting intentions, it's, and it's more so, it's, like personalized questions. So like for me, like one question that I asked was, why am I so fearful around connecting with women, was one of my questions. And the intention is more so getting yourself in the mindset, getting these thoughts up to the forefront, and And you know, in a way, it's meeting medicine where it's at. It's meeting yourself where you're at.
But you mentioned that if you go in with too many expectations, what you think.
So expectation is more like what you. So you go into this thinking that it's going to cure you. You think it's going to answer these questions, and it doesn't always answer those questions. You know, you got to go into it more so like, you know, I'm happy to get anything out of it. And expectation basically it makes like a ceiling. You know, it's like, I'm going to get this. This is going to happen to me. And if you don't get that, then typically it can be, you know, as far as like thinking it's going to be like a silver bullet, can be very defeating. Where intention setting is more just, you know, structuring what you want the experience to be like, instead of what you think the experience is going to be like. I hope that answered you a little bit.
Hi, Tyler. Where is the center in Mexico, and how much is it?
So there's a few centers in Mexico. Right now, I'm not working with any particular center. I do more recovery coaching, but the center that I did work for was Crossroads, and you know, one of the most well-known centers, and they were asking $7,500 a week, and there's a spectrum of costs and amenities. The cheapest center that I know of is asking for $3,500 or $4,000 for the 1 week treatment, and that goes up. I know of treatment centers that charge $30,000 a week, and you know, which I think is just insane. But you know, with these centers, you know, there's a different structure, there's different amenities, psychologists that are on the grounds, and different activities, bringing in massage therapists or Reiki masters and stuff like that. So bare bones minimum treatment, I've heard was the cheapest was $3,500, and there's centers in Mexico, the Bahamas, Canada, Indonesia. So there are certain countries that Ibogaine is legal in.
And I get all this information from your website, correct?
Yeah, so a good way to go about it is to Google search, you know, Ibogaine treatment or Ibogaine Mexico treatment, and you know, certain centers will pop up, and basically what you got to do, you call in and you just feel out what centers work for you, and if that's something you're interested in and you want to know about, you know, after this talk is over, I can talk with you and point you in the right direction.
Thank you.